got so excited making this video, I even made some slides, like a presentation. So this is kind of exciting for me. I'm going to talk to you today about weird fiction. It is a project that I'm currently taking on, and it's something that I've been doing for years on and off, but I'd like to take it a bit more seriously going forward, spend more time in the sort of classic golden age of weird fiction. And I was thinking, you know, when I came across this topic or this genre, I had 3 questions. The first one is, how do I know that I would like something like this? Like, how do I know I'd like it? What clues from my past would lead me down this path to hint that I might like this genre? Number 2 is, what is it? Where does it come from? How did it get formed? I really like historical context and I like the story of things. So I really wanted somebody to lay down the foundation and explain this to me, especially from like a literary canon sort of way. So that's question number 2. And the third is, would you have any beginner-friendly recommendations before I dive deep into like the core of it all? So that's what I'm going to try to do in this video. So I'm once again making the video that I wish I had. Also, a bit of a disclaimer before I start. Number 1, a lot of these authors are not necessarily paragons of virtue or examples of model citizens, but that's okay. We're just here to look at their writing. Number 2, when you go into weird circles and weird fiction communities, there are types of people you'll meet. There are some people who really like to gatekeep this community. There are people who take it very seriously in a religious sort of angle. And of course, there are people who are absolutely wonderful and they share resources and books and recommendations. Like, some of my favorite people that I've ever encountered through YouTube are people who read weird fiction, and I'm very grateful to have them in my circle and in my life. Just take that with a grain of salt. Also, I'm just one person, so there are many books, many authors that I won't be able to mention. Let's get started. The first point is, how do I know that I would like this? Like, this genre of speculative fiction. Here are some examples from things from my childhood that I really loved, that I think have elements of weird fiction in them from the mainstream. Like, I'm talking really mainstream. Did you like Disney's Atlantis? Specifically, you know, the Shepherd's Journal and the Elder Stones, the Giants. A lot of these elements show up, especially in Clark Ashton Smith's work and a lot of Lovecraft. I really enjoyed Atlantis and I devoured it a lot. I really like language, and Milo was a linguist. So I don't know, just a lot of that movie kind of held something special that is very similar to a lot of weird fiction. Did you also happen to watch The Mummy over and over again? Because The Mummy has a lot of elements too, not just in terms of the hieroglyphs and the pyramids, but you know, the Book of the Dead and just elements from it. Did you like Sinbad and the Legend of the Seven Seas? Not just the Book of Peace, but did you like Eris, the goddess of chaos, and her monsters she unleashes onto the world? That might also be a clue that you might like this genre. Did you like mythological elements from Pirates of the Caribbean, specifically when it came to Davy Jones and the Flying Dutchman? Did you enjoy Stranger Things, especially those monsters lurking in the Upside Down? If you're a classics kind of person, do you enjoy gothic horror or Victorian gothic, Victorian ghost stories? Are you drawn to Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights over the other Brontes? Like, do you favor Wuthering Heights a bit more than the other ones? Are you drawn to Sherlock Holmes, particularly in text, and some of Doyle's occult writings? Early Tim Burton, especially Guillermo del Toro and his monsters. Did you accidentally cross over into the Twilight Zone many times and enjoy that kind of vibe and show? And you know, the occult people as well, like Aleister Crowley, Neville Goddard, Dolores Cannon, Edgar Cayce, and you know, Seth Speaks, or any kind of mediums that just draw your attention. Not necessarily, you don't have to believe it, but like, these things kind of interest you, these kinds of people interest you, and you find yourself drawn to a fascination with this kind of realm. If you find all of these things kind of cool, you might enjoy weird fiction. I am going to give you a quote directly from Lovecraft. It is a bit rearranged and paraphrased here. In his writing on weird fiction, he lists 4 points about the types of weird fiction you can have, but ultimately what ties them all together is atmosphere. Atmosphere, not action, is the great desideratum of weird fiction. So here are his 4 points. It is a mood or a feeling. It expresses a pictorial conception. It expresses a general situation, condition, legend, or intellectual conception. And 4, it explains a definite tableau or specific dramatic situation or climax. And this mood thing is something that is like a running thread throughout all of the books I'm going to mention. Going a bit backwards, if I were to draw the origins of weird fiction, I would kind of put it like an upside down funnel, and then a funnel the other way, where at the center you have the golden age. The entire genre of speculative fiction, which includes horror and fantasy and science fiction, if you take them all back to their roots, they have similar roots. So they all kind of share ancestry, as it were. And then it becomes kind of like really dominant, and it splits up into all of these different genres and categories. And I guess my librarian brain likes to categorize things and label things and file them. And in recent years, there are so many subgenres that people really like to label and differentiate between, you know, solar punk and diesel and grim noir and sword and sorcery. So all of these subgenres that become, you know, labeled with a stamp happened a bit later. But if you were to trace each one back to its origins, they share this common ancestry. So let's say the common ancestry sort of starts with the Victorian Gothic, with Edgar Allan Poe. And there are many figures here, like Lord Dunsany, M.R. James, E.F. Benson. I'm listing a few on the screen right now, but there are a few others that I've left out, like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Mrs. Gaskell could go under here. There are several other figures that could be listed as like the origins. There's the Southern Gothic. Many of these elements you would see in both weird fiction, but also later on, as I said, in horror and in other things. If we were to go even further back, I'm sure you can find elements, like there are elements of the occult and supernatural things and weirdness in Shakespeare, like The Tempest or Midsummer Night's Dream, or you could go even further back if you want to the Odyssey with Scylla and Charybdis. Like there are so many elements in the history of literature that could be drawn on to say that they have been prototypes of science fiction or the speculative or the supernatural. But I'm working with a particular mood and feeling here, and I think the Gothic or the Victorian Gothic kind of explains it best, and the feeling of the sublime. As we get into H.P. Lovecraft and his circle, and I'm going to mention the circle again a few times, as we get into his specific kind of weird fiction and horror, you start to notice elements from this past with a sprinkle of his own twist on things, with creation and innovation of his own monsters, his own gods, and his own kind of particular kind of sublime horror, which is called cosmic horror, also known as Eldritch or Lovecraftian horror. And I'm going to read to you the official definition, where it says cosmic horror or Eldritch and Lovecraftian horror is a subgenre of weird fiction emphasizing the horror of the unknowable and incomprehensible, forbidden and dangerous knowledge, madness, non-human influences on humanity, religion and superstition, fate and inevitability, and the risks associated with scientific discoveries. It's the realization that the universe is more vast and complicated than you'll ever begin to comprehend. Elder gods and their indifference to humanity and to our pathetic existence. All of this has mood and atmosphere at its core in the way it is told. When Lovecraft started publishing, at first he was kind of a ghostwriter. He published a few things here and there, and then in 1923 the Weird Tales magazine got started, and he started publishing a lot for them, submitting short stories. The people listed in the slide as the circle are people who not only looked up to him and became friends with him, but also wrote things inspired by him or similar to his work. And these authors really kind of bounced off each other. They would dedicate works to each other. They would make references to each other's works, and they also published within their own right their own things, their own pulp fiction books, and some of them started their own genre, like Sword and Sorcery was started by Robert E. Howard. Derleth started Arkham House. Like, there's a lot of not only fraternity, but a lot of sort of references on and off here, a lot of correspondence between these people, a lot of admiration back and forth, but it is a very tight circle and it is closed. And of course, afterwards, things opened up a lot. Although its peak was kind of between the two world wars, afterwards, people started writing more things like it. And then there was also the rise of television, and you have things like The Twilight Zone, and you have references and movies and kind of pulpy movies. And there's the fear of chemical and nuclear war, and science fiction as a genre started to grow in many different directions from there. So I would say that after the 30s, weird fiction starts to be reinvented every single time in new waves. And it continues to be created to this day. Lastly, I will mention that, you know, people like Arthur Machen and M.R. James were English, whereas Lovecraft and some of his circle were American, and the two are often very different in style and in the way they tell stories, and there are many, many other influences of the time who have published short stories. All of these people were published in magazines like the ones you see on the screen. Astounding later became Analog. I made a whole video on that, but the majority of the weird fiction tales were published in Weird Tales, and I have a very big video planned for Weird Tales very soon. So that said, concluding the history portion of this video, let's get into recommendations for beginners, and this is the way I eased my way into it. So the first person and the ultimate kind of entry point, I think, is Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury is, to me at least, the spirit of Halloween and 80s, and a lot of the vibes that you get from something like Stranger Things, I think, is captured in Ray Bradbury's works, specifically his short story collections, The October Country, From the Dust Returned, and One More for the Road. So these three, and maybe even the Halloween Tree, of course, but these works, they're short stories. A lot of them are wonky and creepy, but also playful, but they have this element of the weird, and there's just something very playful about his works that is not horror, it's not scary, but it is a bit, like, I don't even know how to word it. But yeah, whatever it is, Bradbury's got it. Some of Neil Gaiman's works, specifically Smoke and Mirrors, maybe some of the ways he talks about literature. Another person you might love is Jeff Vandermeer. Both Vandermeers actually, Jeff and Anne, they are big on weird fiction in general. They have anthologized several weird short story collections. One of them, I think, is over 1,000 pages long. But the writing, the fiction writing that's original as well from Vandermeer is absolute weird fiction, but it's reinvented. It is part of the now, and the language is, of course, more contemporary. And I'm not just talking about the Area X trilogy where you have like Annihilation and certain elements of it, but just the way he writes, and you can see it in his interests as well. He has a book that he's published that revolves around Crowley. Just his writing in general, I think, is a good entry point. Alan Moore is one of my favorite people. I think he's absolutely gorgeous in every way. I would definitely recommend Swamp Thing. And of course his other novels are more popular because of TV shows. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is another one that you might enjoy for this vibe. He has a wonderful video on what is magic, and it's so inspiring, and just it gives you all the good feels. Another person that I love, Victor Laval. I have read The Changeling, and I've read his short story Up From Slavery, and I have a few more things from him on my list. He just gives off the right vibes. There are many references to Lovecraft in his works. He's a good contemporary writer that gives off this vibe. Another person you might enjoy is Caitlin Kiernan. I have read a book that came out from Tachyon called The Very Best of Caitlin Kiernan, and their writing is just so highly atmospheric, a lot of references to water. I don't know, I just love Kiernan's writing. Whatever it is that creates that mood, Kiernan knows how to do it, and they do it really well. Now, there are retellings, like T. Kingfisher's retellings of Poe, or Kish Johnson's retellings of Lovecraft. There are many, many retellings. Almost every year, there's a new anthology or something that comes out where people like to either retell or make references to Lovecraft. There is a book coming out this fall from Tachyon, I think, that is, again, Lovecraftian retellings. But, you know, there's always something going on. There are cookbooks like the Necronomicon Nom Nom. Like, it depends on what angle you want to take to enter this genre. If you kind of really like podcasts, for example, you might really enjoy Lore by Aaron Mahnke. I've spoken about Lore before, and it is non-fiction, but it still has this vibe. And it might send you to look up different things. His other graphic novels, Wellington, might be something up your alley. It has those vibes as well. But a podcast that kind of has this Aaron Mahnke lore plus the Twilight Zone vibe is Welcome to Night Vale. The Night Vale podcast is huge. It has several publications of books that came out of it. Most of them are transcripts or novelizations of the podcast, so you can consume it in whatever format you'd like, but it really does give those weird vibes. You have this very strange town with a lot of strange people, a lot of weird things are happening, and I find that a lot of Korean and Japanese horror sometimes contain elements of this that's not completely like, you know, slasher and things to terrify you or gore or psychological thrillers, but they're a mood. And there are some creatures or something weird is happening that I've seen happen more in Japanese and Korean horror. So one example is The Hole. This is a book I read a few years ago and it blew me away. There's this like giant hole that gets bigger and bigger and consumes the main character. Stuff like that. Very, very cool. And, you know, there will always be new and contemporary weird things. Like, I know a lot of people mentioned The Hike. Do you need to read these? Not necessarily. Maybe by the time you get to The Hike, it's already way too advanced, and you might as well just dive into the golden age, dive into the classics, start with the origins, start with the roots. These are just a few things that might draw your attention towards this direction. And I do think that Kiernan and Vandermeer, for example, they're definitely living and writing in this renaissance or new age of the weird, where they've reworked things from the past and added to them something that's of this day and age and something beautiful to them. Okay, so Shirley Jackson and Octavia E. Butler are also two absolute queens when it comes to this atmospheric tone, and Butler definitely has also the supernatural elements that I really, really like. Now, some names that are often thrown around are like John Wyndham, Anne Rice. Yes, I don't know, maybe for me at least, they don't 100% like reach that atmospheric threshold that I'm looking for. And you can argue that, for example, even Kafka has an element of this in his writing. Even Gogol's The Nose has this Kafkaesque Lovecraftian vibe to it. There are elements that you would find in magical realism, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Even some writings by Borges has elements of this in their writing, but they don't necessarily hit it full on. And there are a few recent works that have been recommended to me for this particular vibe and style that combines the sort of weird dark gothic fiction with the sort of magical realism, lurks around the genre. Now, do you have to read any of these introductory things? No. You can go full in with the original crew and read them, but it's fun to see where things come from and look at its history, and it's also fun to see what new people have done with the genre since. So if you want to like alternate and go back and forth, this could be a lot of fun. And these are just some of the people I have personally enjoyed. There are many, many more, and I'm sure some of you will tell me in the comments if you want to share. All right, so I hope this was useful. I will see you in my next video. Bye.